A man who has redrawn the map of Italy and brought an ancient empire to its knees cannot simply go home and sit quietly. Power, once tasted, is a constant hunger. And in Paris, the politicians of the Directory knew they were living in the same cage as a lion. Their solution was not to tame him, but to point him towards a new, distant meal, hoping he would choke on it. They offered him England, a direct invasion, a suicidal prospect against the master of the seas, the Royal Navy. Napoleon, a master of the grand gesture, looked at their map and saw a different path, a bolder one, a mad one. Why strike the limbs of the English lion when you could strike at its heart? And for Britain, the heart was not London. It was India, the source of its boundless wealth, and the ancient gateway to India, the strategic choke point of the world, was a land of sun-scorched myth, Egypt. His proposal was fantastical, a fever dream of conquest torn from the pages of his beloved Plutarch. He would lead an army into the land of the pharaohs, sever Britain's lifeline to the Orient, and establish a French colony in the East. From there, who knew? Perhaps he would march in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, all the way to the Indus. For the Directory, it was the perfect solution. It was audacious enough to capture the public's imagination, and so far away, so fraught with peril, that he was almost certain to fail. They would be rid of him for good. They gave him everything he asked for. And so, we arrive at the core of this chapter in his life. The Egyptian campaign was a strategic catastrophe, a military dead end, but it was also Napoleon's masterstroke of propaganda. The moment he transformed himself from a mere general into a lawgiver, a scholar, a figure of legend. It was where he learned that you could lose a war, but if you controlled the story, you could win the future. In May of 1798, the greatest armada since the Crusades set sail from Toulon. Nearly 400 ships, carrying over 50,000 souls, soldiers, sailors, and a collection of men who made this expedition unique in the annals of warfare. For Napoleon did not just bring cannons and muskets, he brought an army of the mind. 167 of them, chemists, biologists, mathematicians, engineers, artists, poets, and linguists. They were the finest minds in France, and they were packed into the fleet's transports alongside the cavalry horses and ammunition crates. They carried not swords, but drafting tools, scientific instruments, and reams of paper. Their mission was not to conquer, but to discover, to measure, to catalog, and to unveil the secrets of a civilization that had haunted the European imagination for millennia. This was to be a conquest of knowledge as much as of land. The hook for France and for history was this bizarre fusion of violence and enlightenment. Who was this man who invaded a country with both grenadiers and geologists? After a characteristically swift and bloodless capture of the island of Malta, the fleet pressed on, playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek with the British fleet scouring the Mediterranean for them. The hunter was a tenacious, one-armed admiral named Horatio Nelson. They missed each other in the fog by a mere handful of miles. Destiny, it seemed, was still on Napoleon's side. On the 1st of July, they landed near Alexandria, and immediately, the dream collided with a brutal reality. Egypt was not the fertile paradise they had imagined. It was a furnace. The soldiers, still in their thick wool European uniforms, stepped from the ships into a blast of heat that stole the breath. Their first taste of this new world was a forced march through the desert towards Cairo. The sun was a merciless hammer. The water ran out. The landscape was an endless shimmering expanse of sand and sky, broken only by the dilapidated hovels of impoverished villages. And then came the mirages. The men, mad with thirst, would see shimmering lakes on the horizon, breaking into a desperate run, only to find more blistering sand. They began to grumble, then to curse. They openly mocked the savants, the scientists, calling them their general's favorite pets. What use was a botanist when you were dying for a canteen of water? Suicides became common. The army of Italy, the proud conquerors, were reduced to a stumbling column of misery. And they were being watched. The rulers of Egypt were the Mamluks, a warrior caste of slave soldiers who had dominated the land for 600 years. They were medieval knights on an 18th century battlefield. Dressed in magnificent, colorful silks, wielding Damascus steel scimitars, they were arguably the finest horsemen in the world. They looked upon the French infantry, plodding through the sand, with contempt. They saw only walking coffins. On July 21st, on the plains of Giza, the two worlds collided. The French army, weary and thirsty, saw two things on the horizon. One was the Mamluk army, a glittering line of 6,000 cavalry and a larger mass of infantry, ready for battle. And the other, rising behind them, hazy in the heat, were the Great Pyramids. This was the moment Napoleon lived for, the fusion of history and glory. He rode before his troops and, with a gesture towards the ancient monuments, delivered the most famous line of his career. "Soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries looked down upon you." He was placing them and himself on the grand stage of human history. He was telling them they were not just fighting for a patch of sand. They were fighting for immortality. His tactics were nothing but romantic. He knew his weary infantry could not outmaneuver the Mamluk cavalry, so he created fortresses of men. He arranged his divisions into massive hollow squares, 6 ranks deep. The outer ranks knelt and presented a hedge of bayonets. The ranks behind them stood ready to fire in volleys. In the center of each square, he placed his cannons and his savants. The Mamluk leaders, Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey, saw these static formations and scoffed. They gave the order to charge. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Mamluk cavalry, for all their individual bravery, charged with futile abandon against the clockwork discipline of Europe. They crashed against the squares like a wave against a rock. Volley after volley ripped through their ranks. Cannons loaded with canister shot tore bloody lanes through the horsemen. They swirled around the squares, firing pistols, hacking with scimitars, searching for a gap, but they could find none. They were utterly annihilated. In less than an hour, the Mamluk power that had ruled Egypt for centuries was broken forever. The Battle of the Pyramids was a stunning, terrifying victory of organization over courage. Napoleon entered Cairo as a conqueror. He presented himself not as a tyrant, but as a liberator, freeing the Egyptians from Mamluk oppression. He showed respect for Islam, met with local imams, and spoke of his admiration for the Prophet Muhammad. It was a calculated performance. Beneath the velvet glove of cultural sensitivity was an iron fist. Any uprising was crushed with merciless brutality. While he consolidated his rule in Cairo, setting up his scientists in the newly formed Institute of Egypt, the trap was sprung. On the night of August 1st, 1798, Admiral Nelson, having finally tracked his prey, found the French fleet anchored in a shallow line in Abu Qir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. The French admiral, Brouet, confident in his defensive position, had made a fatal error. He believed the British would only attack from the seaward side. Nelson, a genius of naval warfare, did the unthinkable. He split his fleet, sending half of his ships on a perilous route between the French line and the shore, attacking them from both sides at once. The battle began at sunset. As darkness fell, the bay was lit by the hellish glare of cannon fire from 200 guns. The climax came around 10 p.m. The French flagship, the magnificent 120. The climax came around 10 p.m. The French flagship, the magnificent 120-gun L'Orient, carrying the plundered treasures of Malta and the army's pay chest, caught fire. The flames raced up the tarred rigging until the entire ship was a towering inferno. Then, with a cataclysmic explosion that was seen and heard for miles, L'Orient disintegrated. The battle paused for a full 10 minutes, the crews of both fleets stunned into silence by the sheer scale of the blast. By morning, the French fleet was gone. 11 ships of the line had been captured or destroyed. Only 2 escaped. The Battle of the Nile was one of the most decisive naval victories in history. And for Napoleon and his 50,000 men, it was a death sentence. With a single stroke, Nelson had severed their connection to France. They were trapped. The conqueror of Egypt was now its prisoner. Here we see the core of his genius shift. The military situation was dire, but Napoleon, the creator, began his greatest work of propaganda. While his soldiers languished, he threw himself into the work of his institute. His dispatches back to France, carried by blockade-running frigates, barely mentioned the naval disaster. Instead, they were filled with thrilling accounts of the Battle of the Pyramids and, more importantly, with the discoveries of his savants. They were creating the first scientific survey of a nation. They cataloged the flora and fauna, studied ancient irrigation techniques, mapped the country with unprecedented accuracy, and sketched the temples and ruins. They laid the foundations for the Suez Canal, and, most famously, one of his soldiers unearthed a black slab of basalt inscribed with 3 different scripts: the Rosetta Stone, the key that would one day unlock the forgotten language of the hieroglyphs and give voice to those 40 centuries. Napoleon was consciously crafting a new narrative. He was no longer a stranded general. He was Alexander the Great, bringing Hellenistic wisdom to the East. He was a Roman lawgiver, reforming Egyptian society. The military failure was being buried under an avalanche of cultural and scientific triumph. But reality could not be held at bay forever. The Ottoman Empire, the nominal ruler of Egypt, declared war. In early 1799, Napoleon decided to preempt them. He took 13,000 of his best men and marched north into Syria. The Syrian campaign was a horror. It lacked any of the romanticism of the pyramids. At the city of Jaffa, after the French stormed the walls, a massacre ensued. Thousands of captured Ottoman soldiers were marched to the beach and systematically shot and bayoneted over the course of 3 days, a cold-blooded decision made by Napoleon to conserve food and avoid having to guard them. Days later, the plague broke out in the French army. The hospitals were filled with men dying in agony, covered in black pustules. In a famous and heavily propagandized moment, Napoleon visited the plague hospital at Jaffa. He walked among the sick, touched their sores, and helped carry a body, an act of calculated courage designed to quell the rising panic in his army. It was leadership as theater, a gamble with his own life to maintain morale. He was stopped at the ancient fortress of Acre. Despite weeks of siege, he could not take the city, which was being supplied by the British Navy. Defeated for the first time on land, He was forced into a humiliating retreat back to Egypt, his army ravaged by plague and combat. He returned to Cairo to find the situation desperate, but fate granted him one last victory. An Ottoman army had landed by sea at Abu Qir, near the site of his naval disaster. In July 1799, Napoleon attacked them with ferocious speed. The Battle of Abu Qir was a triumph, wiping out the Turkish army and temporarily securing his hold on Egypt. It was during this time that he finally received a bundle of European newspapers, and he learned that while he had been building a legend in the desert, his creation, the French Republic, was crumbling. Austrian and Russian armies were undoing his victories in Italy. The Directory was corrupt, bankrupt, and hated. France was on the brink of anarchy and invasion. His moment had come. The legend was built. The crisis at home was his opportunity. The decision he made next was one of the most controversial of his life. In secret, he made arrangements to leave. He told almost no one. On a dark night in August 1799, taking with him only a handful of his top generals and scientists, Napoleon Bonaparte abandoned his army. He boarded a frigate, the Muron, and slipped past the British blockade, leaving General Kleber in command of the doomed, trapped soldiers with a letter of explanation delivered after he was already at sea. To the army he left behind, it was a betrayal. To history, it was a pivot. He had gone to Egypt, a general of the Republic. He was returning to France to become its master. The desert mirage had served its purpose. Now he set his sights on the ultimate prize, France itself. The France that Napoleon returned to in October 1799 was a nation holding its breath, waiting for a push. The glorious revolution that had stormed the Bastille 10 years earlier had curdled into a swamp of cynicism and exhaustion. The government, the five-man Directory, was famously weak and spectacularly corrupt. The currency was worthless. Brigands controlled the countryside. The left-wing Jacobins were plotting a new reign of terror, while right-wing royalists dreamed of restoring the monarchy. The state was a hollow shell. And this is the simple, crucial core of the story of Napoleon's seizure of power. It was not a glorious conquest, but a high-stakes, borderline farcical gamble that succeeded only because the nation was so desperate for a savior that it was willing to overlook the sheer clumsiness of the coup. It was a victory not of genius, but of audacity. The hook isn't Napoleon's ambition. We already know that. The hook is the state of France itself. Imagine a house whose foundations have been eaten away by termites. It looks like a house. It has the shape of a house, but the slightest tremor will bring it down. Napoleon didn't knock the house down, he just leaned on it, and it collapsed. His journey home was a legend in itself. For 47 days, the frigate Miron zigzagged across the Mediterranean, miraculously dodging Royal Navy patrols. When he finally landed at Fréjus in the south of France, the news spread like wildfire. But the reaction was not what one might expect for a general who had abandoned his army in a strategic dead end. It was rapturous joy. The French people, fed on a steady diet of his propagandized dispatches from Egypt, saw only the victor of the pyramids, the man who had walked with pharaohs. They saw the hero of Lodi and Rivoli, the only successful general the Republic had left. As he traveled north to Paris, his journey became a triumphal procession. Crowds unhitched the horses from his carriage and pulled it themselves. They were not cheering a general, they were cheering a deliverer. Napoleon realized with electrifying clarity that the French people were not going to hold his failures against him. They were going to give him the keys to the kingdom. He arrived in Paris and became the center of every plot. The city was a web of conspiracy. In the smoky salons and quiet back offices, the future of France was being decided. Napoleon, with his immense popularity and the loyalty of the army, was the indispensable piece of every puzzle, the man they called the Sword. He found his partners in a trio of master cynics. First, there was Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, one of the original architects of the revolution, now a leading director. Sieyès was a theorist who believed the government was fatally flawed and needed to be overthrown from within. He had the plan, but he was a former priest, a man of words. He needed a military man to execute it. Second was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the aristocratic, limping ex-bishop who was the most brilliant and unscrupulous diplomat in Europe. Talleyrand could sense a shift in the political winds like a shark senses blood in the water. And he knew the Directory was doomed. He attached himself to Napoleon as the future. And third was Joseph Fouché, the Minister of Police, a former terrorist, a cold, emotionless spy master who knew every secret in Paris. Fouché's job was to protect the Republic, but he did nothing to stop the conspiracy, ensuring the police would look the other way when the moment came.
The plan they hatched, masterminded by Sieyès, was designed to have the veneer of legality. It was a coup in 2 acts. Act 1 used the threat of a fictitious Jacobin plot to persuade the upper house of the legislature, the Council of Ancients, to grant Napoleon command of all troops in Paris and to move the legislative sessions out of the city to the suburban palace of St. Cloud, away from the Parisian mob. Act 2. Once at St. Cloud, Napoleon, backed by his soldiers, would address both houses and persuade them to dissolve the government and appoint a new 3-man provisional consulate to draft a new constitution. The 3 consuls would, of course, be Sieyès, another conspirator named Roger Ducos, and Napoleon himself. Sieyès believed that once in power, he, the intellectual, would easily sideline the soldier. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The date was set for November 9th, 1799, or in the revolutionary calendar, 18 Brumaire.
The first act went perfectly. The Council of Ancients, spooked by rumors of a terrorist plot, dutifully voted to grant Napoleon military command and move to St. Cloud. The conspiratorial directors, Sieyès and Ducos, resigned. Talleyrand bribed the third, Barras, Napoleon's old patron, into stepping down. The remaining 2 were placed under house arrest. The Directory was effectively decapitated. Everything was going according to plan. The next day, the scene shifted to St. Cloud. Thousands of troops loyal to Napoleon surrounded the palace. But inside, things began to unravel. The lower house, the Council of 500, met in the palace's orangery. They were younger, more radical, and deeply suspicious. They began to understand that they had been tricked. Shouts of "the Constitution or death" echoed through the hall. They refused to be intimidated. Napoleon, waiting impatiently outside, grew frustrated. He was a man used to quick, decisive action. The endless political debate was infuriating him. Against the advice of his fellow conspirators, he decided to force the issue. He would address the councils himself. It was the single worst decision of his day. First, he entered the Council of Ancients. But this was not a battlefield. There was no clear objective, no enemy to charge. Faced with a room full of questioning politicians, Napoleon, the master communicator to his troops, became a stumbling, incoherent mess. He rambled about being the god of war, about plots and dangers, but offered no proof, no clear argument. He left the ancients confused and unimpressed. Then he went to the Council of 500, and there he walked into a hornet's nest. As soon as he entered, flanked by 4 grenadiers, the chamber erupted. The deputies saw a general backed by soldiers entering their sacred legislative hall. It was the image of a military dictatorship. They surged towards him, screaming, "Down with the dictator! Outlaw him!" In their flowing Roman-style togas, they surrounded him, shoving, grabbing. One deputy allegedly raised a dagger. Another grabbed him by the collar. For the first time in his adult life, Napoleon Bonaparte lost his nerve. He was suffocated, overwhelmed. He paled, nearly fainted, and had to be half carried out of the chamber by his grenadiers, his face scratched, his uniform torn. The man who had faced down Austrian cannons at Lodi had been routed by a group of angry lawyers. The coup was on the verge of complete collapse. Back outside, the situation was desperate. Inside, the council was moving to declare Napoleon an outlaw, a decree that would mean any citizen could kill him on sight. The troops surrounding the palace were hesitant, hearing the uproar. They were loyal to the Republic, not to a would-be dictator. This was the moment of truth, and the savior was not Napoleon, but his younger brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who happened to be the elected president of the Council of 500. In a stroke of theatrical genius, Lucien ran out of the chamber, leaped onto a horse, and addressed the guards. He lied brilliantly. He told the soldiers that the council was being terrorized by a minority of deputies armed with daggers, fanatics in the pay of England. He swore that they had tried to assassinate their general Napoleon. Then, for the grand finale, he drew his sword and pointed it at his brother's chest, crying out that he would be the first to kill Napoleon himself if he ever betrayed the liberty of France. It was pure melodrama, and it worked. The guards were convinced. The order was given. The drums began to beat, a steady, menacing rhythm. A column of grenadiers, led by the flamboyant cavalryman Joachim Murat, advanced on the orangery. When they reached the doors, Murat bellowed one of the most famous commands in French history: "Foutez-moi tout ce monde là dehors." Throw all these people out. The drums rolled. The soldiers leveled their bayonets and charged into the hall. The politicians' shouts turned to cries of panic. The great legislators of France, who had sent a king to the guillotine, were sent scrambling for their lives, comically clambering out of windows and disappearing into the foggy evening, their white togas scattering across the palace gardens. The coup, which had nearly failed in farce, was won by force. That night, a rump of the legislators was rounded up and forced to vote to officially dissolve the government and appoint the 3 provisional consuls, Napoleon, Sieyès, and Ducos. As the 3 men sat by a fire in a room at the palace exhausted, they began to discuss the new constitution. Sieyès, the great theorist, imagined he would be in charge. He soon learned the truth. In the political battles that followed, Napoleon, now recovered and ice-cold in his resolve, outmaneuvered him at every turn. He took Sieyès's complex power-sharing constitution and reworked it, creating a new position for himself, first consul, a position with near dictatorial authority. The other 2 consuls were reduced to mere advisors. Sieyès, The man who had planned the coup to gain power for himself was pensioned off to a country estate. He had provided the key, but Napoleon had seized the house. 10 years after the revolution began, it was over. Liberty, equality, fraternity had been replaced by a new trinity: order, authority, and glory. France, bled dry by chaos and desperate for stability, had traded its freedom for a strong man. Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy from Corsica, the outcast at Brienne, the hero of Italy, the legend of Egypt, was now the undisputed master of France. He was 30 years old. He had achieved supreme power. But power at home was not enough. To secure his rule, he needed to secure France. Europe was still at war with them. The Austrians were back in Italy, and the shadow of defeat still loomed. The first consul knew he had to do what General Bonaparte had always done best. He began to gather an army. His eyes turned, once again, to the Alps. The whirlwind was about to become a hurricane.